Let me welcome you again to our celebration of President Ronald Reagan Centennial. We have had, I think, a really well-reviewed, fabulous panel that preceded this lunch, and now we have a number of fabulous speakers during this lunch. Our first speaker was born in the Soviet Union. In the decades before the fall of the Soviet Union, that country's most well-known dissident was nuclear physicist Andrei Sakharov, who won the 1975 Nobel Peace Prize. Andrei's wife, Yelena, was a fearsome dissident in her own right. She was wounded twice while serving as a nurse in World War II. She helped political prisoners beginning when she was very young, and was a founding member of something called the 1976 Moscow-Helsinki Group, which was founded to try and hold Moscow to account for the agreements it had signed, the Helsinki Agreements in 1975. She joined her husband in internal exile in the 1980s before moving back to Moscow, and after her husband's 1989 death, she remained active and remains active in human rights issues, denouncing the August 91 coup, the Russian invasion of Chechnya, and she remains a critic of Vladimir Putin. We had very much hoped to have her with us today, but she is unable to join us. We are delighted to have her son, Alexey, with us to read a letter from her. Alexey, by the way, is the president of the Sakharov Foundation, which exists to continue advancing human rights. Andrei, thank you.
I will first read a short note from my mother, and then hopefully also have a few words in general for myself. Dear friends, I am honored to have been invited to participate in this commemorative discussion in honor of President Reagan's 100th birthday. I am also very disappointed that through my own fault of being old and frail, I am unable to be with you and instead can only send a few words from the hospital bed. I was eagerly looking forward to this event because I think that the occasion, the centennial of Ronald Reagan, is both truly worthy of celebration and a wonderful reason to reflect on the importance of principled politics in a democratic society. Democracies are capable of achieving great things, the greatest in the history of mankind, but they need leaders that inspire such achievements. Ronald Reagan was such a leader. He was able to project optimism without being simplistic and to relate practical steps to a few very basic principles dear to all humans, such as political and economic freedom, respect for human dignity, and a sense of responsibility. This is a very rare ability for a politician. Too often, we see examples of politicians who are either consumed by details and unable to communicate a larger vision, or populists who offer easy and false solutions based on slogans. Reagan was neither. He was able to find practical solutions through, if needed, imperfect compromises and evolutionary steps, yet never to betray his principles. In American politics, another president, Abraham Lincoln, had the same ability to never lose sight of basic principles while engaged in practical politics. Of course, another link to Lincoln was Reagan's famous humor. I do not have statistics, but it feels that these two presidents hold a record on jokes and one-liners. On a personal level, I always felt that my late husband, Andrei Sakharov, had a similar outlook. He liked to say that difficult decisions must be based on simple principles. This is what made it possible for Reagan to be both tough and pragmatic in foreign relations, particularly with the Soviet Union. His leadership and his policies contributed greatly to the demise of the Soviet Union. We are seeing his legacy growing even now as civilization based on democracy, freedom of ideas, and human rights expands throughout the world. For the Soviet Union dissidents, Reagan's policies provided support both provided both moral and practical support. His administration was genuinely interested in helping the cause of freedom in the Soviet Union. Among many who helped us, I want to mention two people from his administration whom I consider personal friends, George Shultz and Jack Matlock. I apologize that these remarks are necessarily short, as I dictated them in the hospital and while on respirator. Again, I am sorry that I am unable to be with you today, though in my thoughts I join you in this celebration. My best wishes to everyone. Yelena Bonner. And from myself, and as president of the Andrei Sakharov Foundation, I wanted to also join in this celebration and add a few words about the principal stance that Ronald Reagan and people in his administrations always took on defense of human rights. And in particular, I myself am very grateful for the help that our family has received. The same people that my mother already mentioned, but also Paula Debransky, who is present in this room, whom I met with many times while in the 80s when the whereabouts and the well-being of my parents were in question. Both my mother and my stepfather had very high opinion of Reagan as a politician, as a leader of the free world at the critical moment in history, and attributed to him most of the successes that we have seen in the 80s. But since we had this discussion that my mother was supposed to participate in but was unable to, I just wanted to add one more perspective, that in particular, even before the famous Reagan speech, and there are some indications that even that there may have been some influence, Dr. Sakharov wrote a letter about the necessity of the Western countries taking a strong stand against the Soviet Union, which in many ways the Reagan's policies have implemented. But if my mother was part of that discussion, she would have pointed out that the muscularity of the Reagan's policy, foreign policy, was primarily based on the build-up of conventional army, military, which that either after the fall of the Soviet Union, neither country have shown, there were no evidence that the Soviet Union was engaged in any attempts to initiatives related to SDI, nor has SDI progressed much in technical terms in the United States. There is the practical build-up of the military and the practical firm stand that Reagan took against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, the immediate proximate causes of all the economic, political, and military troubles that the Soviet Union has faced and that led to its demise. So I'm sure my mother would have contributed more thoughts, but that's the one that I had. And again, I'm very glad to be here with everybody on this great occasion. Thank you very much.
Our next speaker is Stewart McLaurin, who is the Executive Director of the Ronald Reagan Centennial Celebration. Stewart first approached Judy and I about a year ago regarding an event highlighting President Reagan's contribution to the freedom of millions. Stewart has served in high-level positions in the Motion Picture Association, the Red Cross, and Georgetown University. Stewart also served in the 1984 re-elect campaign, then as Energy Secretary James Watson's executive assistant. Stewart, thank you so much for working with us on this event.
Well, good afternoon, Excellencies and friends of Ronald Reagan. Thank you, Lauren, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you in advance for all that you've done for freedom the past 6 years as the president of our IRI. And a special thanks to Gail Burt and Judy Van Rest. And Lauren was right, it was just over a year ago that we first met in your offices and had the conversation about the Reagan Centennial that has resulted in this wonderful event that we've been participating in today. I'm humbled to be among such an important group of leaders and here to represent the Reagan Centennial on behalf of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation. And thank you for this wonderful tribute today to President Reagan. Who could have imagined that more than 30 years ago, when President Reagan gave that incredible speech at Westminster, that we would be here today in such a radically transformed world? It was through that speech, and more so through his 8 years as president, that Ronald Reagan inspired freedom, and Ronald Reagan changed the world. And the legacy of President Reagan in terms of freedom and democracy is alive and growing today because of organizations like IRI and others and everyone in this room. Special thanks to Congressman David Dreier, who we'll hear from, who is a longtime friend of the President and was first elected to Congress in 1980 with a wonderful class and still actively fighting the good fight in the Congress. Thanks to Paula Dobriansky. I understand she was not able to stay for lunch, but she's been a good friend for many years and has been a terrific servant to the cause of democracy and freedom around the world. And the very distinguished panel that we heard this morning, thanks to you for your words and inspiration and encouragement to all of us. To the diplomatic corps, understand over 15 strong here with us today, and the important countries that you represent, important now and also important to President Reagan. In that 1988 speech that led in part to the founding of the National Endowment for Democracy and the International Republican Institute, President Reagan said, "Freedom is not the sole prerogative of a lucky few, but the inalienable and universal right of all human beings." Through the voices that we heard this morning, we are reminded that Ronald Reagan's legacy lives on and continues to inspire people and inspire leaders around the world who love and seek freedom and democracy. The Centennial Celebration is a year-long historic focus on the life, legacy, and the lessons of President Reagan, known personally to many in this room. And it's a global celebration. Just this morning, the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation announced that 4 European nations, Poland, Hungary, the Czech Republic, and the United Kingdom, will honor the 100th birthday of President Reagan with a series of tributes from June 27th to July 4th, 2011, including the unveiling of a statue of President Reagan in Grosvenor Square in London, and the unveiling of a statue in Budapest, and many other important events in those 4 countries. We are also honored to announce that former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice will be joining us on those occasions and will represent Mrs. Reagan at several of those events. You can go to our website, which is reagancentennial.com, to see the full outline of that itinerary and those events that will be taking place throughout those 4 countries. And also, we have just unveiled a special section of that website focused specifically on our international initiatives with the Reagan Centennial and the Reagan Foundation. And even though we're only 5 months into the centennial year, having started 2011, believe it or not, with the Ronald Reagan-themed float in the Tournament of Roses parade, we had a wonderful celebration weekend at the library in Simi Valley, California, with Congressman Dreier and many more in this room, who joined us to unveil a completely transformed, state-of-the-art library and museum experience. We've also had serious educational programs in partnership with major universities, the University of Southern California and the University of Virginia this past spring, and this fall with the United States Naval Academy, Notre Dame, Georgetown, and Pepperdine. And we will soon announce the recipients of the Ronald Reagan Foundation GE Scholarship Awardees. And again, with Congressman Dreier, we were honored to host a reunion of that class of 1980 around this, just before the Centennial Weekend, a terrific gathering at the library. We unveiled in February a commemorative stamp, a forever stamp, bearing the image of President Reagan that is now available across the country. And even American sports teams are paying tribute to the fact that Ronald Reagan's career started as a baseball and racing sportscaster. So the Chicago Cubs and 10 other Major League Baseball teams will host Ronald Reagan tributes at ballparks around this summer, including here in Washington at the Washington Nationals on June the 23rd. And all the impact of these initiatives and these memories of these events will endure long after the centennial year. An important part of the legacy of the centennial will be the impact on behalf of President Reagan with the next generation of leaders. One goal of this centennial is to build an understanding of Ronald Reagan with the next generation of Americans and also with young people around the world who never knew him as a living president. This is not just a reflective and a nostalgic centennial celebration. Rather, we are also looking to the future of America and the future of the world. An important part of this outreach is our National Youth Leadership Committee for the Reagan Centennial. This committee is comprised of 50 student leaders, athletes, and entertainers, all speaking of having been inspired in a personal way by President Reagan's vision of freedom and the example of his leadership. Among them, they have earned 18 Olympic medals, 11 NCAA All-American selections, 5 NCAA championships, 2 certified public platinum records, and 2 are professional racing drivers. And with us today, we actually have 4 members of this committee of young American leaders, David Will of Princeton, Heath Mayo of Brown University, Brody Conover of Georgetown, and Matt McKillop of Georgetown. The members of this National Youth Committee believe, as Ronald Reagan did, that America's best days lie ahead. And as we undertake the international events this summer, we are asking our youth committee to reach out and connect with their peers, with other young people around the world, to engage in a dialogue on freedom, democracy, and on Ronald Reagan. Future leaders connecting with future leaders in the name of Ronald Reagan. Thank you all for being here today, and thank you again, Lauren, at the IRI. And if you're ever in California, you've got to come visit the Reagan Library, and I'd be happy to give you my card, and if you could call me or email when you're coming, I'd be happy to show you around myself. Thank you very much for being here.
That was a great invitation. I have a feeling some folks are going to take you up on that. You've already heard a lot about Congressman David Dreier. He has served in the House, as you heard, since 1981, and he was an early backer of President Reagan's economic and foreign policies. He is chairman of the powerful House Rules Committee, which fashions all legislation that comes to the House floor, and he also chairs the California State Delegation, Republican delegation, not the whole thing. He is dedicated to the cause of advancing democracy abroad. He is the founding chairman of the House Democracy Partnership, which works to improve the functioning of legislatures around the world. He's also, we're proud to say, on IRI's board, but we really asked him here today because he was very close to President Reagan and remains close to his family. Congressman Dreier, thank you.
Thank you very much, Lauren. Mr. President, Mr. Prime Minister, doctors, members of the Diplomatic Corps, let me say what a great pleasure and honor it is for me to be here. I was thinking about how serious this occasion is, and it is a very serious occasion, but I've got to say that, as Alexey said, Ronald Reagan liked to have a lot of fun, and we all know had an amazing sense of humor. And one of the things that I had the challenge of doing, Stewart was talking about the great celebration of the President's 100th birthday, February 6th. The night before, we had this amazing concert, and I had the task of following the Beach Boys, who were doing Surfin' USA and Help Me Rhonda. I wish they all could be California girls, the whole thing. And I will say that I was backstage, and I looked out, and you all should know this, as I looked into the audience there, right on the front row, rocking it out at 90 and almost a half, 90 and a half actually, more than 90 and a half, was Secretary of State George Shultz, Ed Meese, and many other members of the President's cabinet. And I was struck that, with all due respect to all of the other presidential libraries that are out there, it was difficult for me to imagine the Truman Library or Lyndon Baines Johnson having the kind of celebration of his 100th birthday that Ronald Reagan had at the Reagan Library. And that's why I want to encourage all of you to seize Stewart's invitation. And there are lots of great docents out there. And actually, I've been there enough that I can probably, if Stewart is unable to take you, I'd be happy to take you and show you around as well. Let me just say that when I think about this occasion, it is an extraordinarily important one, because there was a tendency to, today, there is a tendency to take for granted what we have seen in this amazing panel that we have. Ambassador Patterson, when I went over, she said, gosh, you know, we tend to forget that this was not inevitable. That this was not inevitable. And I was thinking, Ann, after you said that to me, that actually Ronald Reagan would have disagreed with you. Ronald Reagan would have disagreed with you because he was convinced that it was inevitable. And one of the great stories that I like to share about his confidence, and it is at the base of that statue. And by the way, I will extend to all of you who are here, members of the diplomatic corps and members of the panel, as you're here, I want you to come to the great rotunda of the United States Capitol to see the statue of Ronald Reagan. It is extraordinarily impressive, and at the base of that statue, there is an inscription. It's actually on the back. America's best days are yet to come. Our proudest moments are yet to be. Our most glorious achievements are just ahead. You have to turn your head around a little to look at the back of it because it's got the governor and the president and his name on the front. And so not everyone sees that, but those very important messages are there, and that demonstrates the fact that he did, Anne, believe this was inevitable. The other thing that I find very striking was Reagan's sense of optimism about every challenge that he faced. And I love to share a story. In 1982, if you think about the economic challenges through which we're going today, in some ways, they obviously didn't last as long as what we've gone through today, but in some ways they paled to what we went through in the early 1980s. And you, Dr. Schmidt, were talking about the economic challenges that existed in the 1970s and the lack of confidence. Ronald Reagan in 1982, when the unemployment rate was double-digit, inflation was sky high, interest rates were 16-17%, was at a small luncheon in the summer of 1982. And we were at a home in Bel Air, California, and there were about 20 of us at lunch. And everyone at this gathering was, of course, commiserating over how horrible the economy was and the challenges that we faced. And the president stood up after lunch, and he looked out and he said, you know, the other day somebody asked me how I was doing, and he said, I've never been better. Well, everyone kind of looked at each other. My God, with all these challenges and difficulties, how in the world could he come to that kind of conclusion? The president said, the reason I say that is that I'm reminded of this huge caravan of farm animals being driven through a countryside, and there is this terrible accident. Animals strewn all over the highway, and up comes the sheriff. And he jumps out of his car and he looks down and he sees this horse, 2 broken legs, frothing at the mouth. So he takes out his gun and puts the horse out of its misery. Then he looks over and he sees a dog, just about the same thing. The dog is shaking like there's no tomorrow, so he takes out his gun, puts it to the dog's head, and puts him out of his misery. And then he looks over and sees the driver of one of the vehicles. This man was bloodied, his leg was broken. And the sheriff looked to the driver and said, and how are you feeling? He said, I've never been better. And so that, Ann, is the reason that is clearly the reason, Mr. President, that Ronald Reagan knew that what had taken place was inevitable. And I will tell you as we look, and you, Mr. Prime Minister, I'm particularly impressed with the fact that you looked at the interdependence of what's taken place in Iraq and the Arab Spring, which, again, is a very, very impressive message for us. We have a great deal of work ahead. And Lauren was just saying to me that we've got a good 15 years ahead of us as we look at the challenge of the Arab awakening, the Arab Spring. But I will say I was struck the other day with The Economist about a month before last when they talked about the fact that this notion that somehow those barbarians in that part of the world could not move towards self-determination has been completely shattered with what we have seen. And so this is part of the inevitability that Ronald Reagan talked about throughout his entire presidency. And I will say that as we look at the work that is done, I want to tell you that it is being done in a bipartisan way. I'm happy that Carl Gershman and Ken Wallach are both here, the presidents of the National Endowment for Democracy and the National Democratic Institute. And this really is a partnership as the president envisaged it, because it doesn't, the notion of self-determination and the development of democratic institutions is not simply a partisan issue. I will say that one of the things that I want all of you to know is that the notion of that famous 1982 speech at Westminster is alive and thriving today. 6 years ago, I joined with my Democratic colleague, Congressman David Price, as Lauren mentioned, in establishing something called the House Democracy Partnership. The notion was, in this post-September 11th world, it was very important for us as a nation to make sure that we see the development of those institutions. And so we have partnered now with 14 countries, recognizing that as we pursue the building of the institutions, the rule of law, that building parliaments is a critically important part of that. And so we decided, as we look at these countries, to partner with them, and it is a partnership, to help them develop their committee structures in the parliament, their budget process, their oversight of the executive branch, their constituent services, their libraries. And so we've been working with 14 countries to make this happen. Now, obviously, the Arab Spring has played a big role in creating unique opportunities for us to work together. But one of the things that we know, as again the Economist has pointed out, we can't simply have the Made in America stamp as we go there. And so working with some of the other partner countries is something that I think is going to be very important for us to do. And so a few weeks ago, I was privileged to be in Indonesia, meeting with President Yudhoyono and members of parliament, and being the largest Muslim population in the world and a 12-year-old democracy, and the Indonesians have taken democracy like a duck to water. It's incredible to see. They're enthused about being part of the international community and playing a role in Egypt as we see the tremendous changes take place there. Similarly, our House Democracy Partnership is going to be joining, as we have with other countries, including, I'm thinking of Liberia, where that amazing Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who was honored by the International Republican Institute, has provided great leadership as the first woman elected president of any country on the continent of Africa. And when it came to establishing our program, she just told me that we were going to have a House Democracy Partnership with Liberia. I didn't have a say in it. She's that strong and that bold. So we've been able to work on these kinds of things, and it all stems from that Westminster speech. It all stems from that vision that Ronald Reagan put forward. It is very unique to find a president who has the ability to pursue and outline lofty ideas with such eloquence and at the same time recognize that it takes more than eloquence to govern. And that's something that Ronald Reagan was able to partner with. One of my professors, a guy called Peter Drucker, said that every brilliant idea ultimately devolves into nothing but hard work. And that's what the National Endowment for Democracy, the IRI and NDI and the other organizations and so many of you are doing. And so as we stand here recognizing Ronald Reagan's 100th birthday, as we look at the very important challenges that lie ahead, I want to say thank you to all of you for the work that you have done, and more important than that, as Lauren said, with 15 years ahead, thank you in the name of Ronald Reagan for everything you're going to do for the cause of freedom in the future.
You've gotten a lot of invitations today. I'm going to invite all of you over to IRI because anybody who's been over there knows that as you go up the stairs to our large meeting room where we do all of our meetings, staff meetings and all, and then we do events, knows that at the top of the stairs is a very, very large portrait. I think it's about 8 feet by 10 feet of President Reagan. So as we work over the next 15 years or however long it's going to be, we will take inspiration every morning from his words and his example. Thank you all very much for being with us today.